What were the most impactful things to happen during Dead by Daylight history, the things that altered the game significantly and led to huge change? Today I want to look through and pick 10 different moments that changed DBD forever. Hey everyone, and let's get into it. Cast your mind back to the 18th of August 2016, just 2 months after the game's release. On this day came the Nurse. The Nurse alone is one of the game's biggest and most impactful additions in the entirety of Dead by Daylight history, with her forever being the strongest character in the game from release to present day. The impact Nurse has had is honestly sort of crazy. What other game can you think of where the strongest thing in the meta has remained the strongest for over 7 years? It's sort of unheard of. Nurse was added way back in Chapter 1 of the game in 2016, when the game was still finding its footing. She of course released 2 in a much more busted state. She had up to 7 blinks and was far more powerful than she is now. Despite the many nerfs over the years though, she's never quite shifted from her top spot. The closest we've ever come to a shift in killer meta is the addition of Blight in 2020. Even then, he is still widely considered the weaker of the two. Why Nurse has never been nerfed from her top spot is sort of a conspiracy in itself, but ultimately now she's so affixed to that spot that people have sort of stopped complaining about it. Nurse is the best and always has been, and that's sort of a weird thing to think about. Moving on to later in 2016, specifically the 25th of October 2016, the Halloween chapter dropped. This was huge for Dead by Daylight at the time, and one of the most impactful things on the game's future. The first ever license in the game, and an absolutely huge one at that. This was quite shocking at the time, with the game seeming relatively small still, yet receiving such a huge license. This chapter isn't just here however for its license impact, it's actually here for its gameplay and meta impact too, as this chapter brought along a bunch of broken and strong new perks, new mechanics, and a whole lot of chaos. There were some truly busted things in this chapter, and perks that released such as Decisive Strike, which have dominated the meta for years on end. It's actually surprising how much of the meta comes from so long ago, and even specifically this chapter. It wasn't all entirely negative, but there were definitely a bunch of issues this chapter introduced. These issues sort of plaguing the game for years to come, some only being solved fairly recently. This is an incredibly important moment in DBD history, not just for the impact of it being the first license, but also because of the gameplay impact. This is debatably DBD's most important moment ever. The first year of the game was really a big deal, which is why we have quite a few moments from this year. The 6th of December 2016, and the release of Totems and Hexes with the Hag is next up. This to me is a huge turning point for the game, and I would even debate my argument could realistically apply to the much later Resident Evil chapter on the 15th of June 2021 as well. This is the addition of secondary in-game mechanics and goals. Totems introduced a whole new objective to deal with, something thrown at survivors and used by killers to alter how the trial could function. This was a huge deal, I think, even if at the time it was fairly bare bones, and considering how they've become more closely integrated into powers over time, this makes it a huge moment, a time that shifted the game into something quite different. Beyond this, hexes as a whole have had a huge meta impact, with Ruin dominating the meta for so long, only really nerfed down after the introduction of even more broken hexes, such as Undying. Totems changed the dynamic of gameplay, and today can be used for a variety of things in a wide range of interactions. We further have boon perks too, which directly affect the totems. Considering the game as a whole, we've never had another introduction like this, at least one that isn't killer specific. The game would be very different without the presence of totems, however small they feel. The 17th of September 2019 is next up. This is the release of Stranger Things. Stranger Things was a big deal not only for its impact on the game and its player numbers, but also because it was a huge modern horror license too. It was a step in the direction of more variety and exploration, and just in general stepping into a new era for the game. A moment which I honestly think was the catalyst for many of the game's quality of life updates later on, like the map reworks and stuff like that. This felt like the moment the game truly locked in and began really preparing for the future and its survival. This is also a notable chapter though beyond this, as the first chapter to leave the game on the 17th of November 2021, another huge moment for the game that came just after another one of its biggest successes, the Resident Evil chapter. It was a shocking moment and downturn for the game at the time, which felt like it was just winning. Of course we did get it back just under 2 years later, on the 6th of November 2023, making it the first license to also return. I think all in all though, this chapter was a valuable lesson too, in appreciating something whilst it's there. When this chapter left, people begged to have it return endlessly. One of the most well-loved, well-known, and most important chapters in the game's history, for reasons of its impact as well as loss. Following this quickly up on the 29th of October 2019 was the Archives and the Rift, a huge step for the game, and a thing that completely changed it. A time the game not only began to offer seasonal progression, but further decided to begin expanding its world and lore. This to many is not going to mean much, the lore isn't for everyone, but I bet most people who watch this channel do care about the lore and are interested in some aspect. This update therefore basically made the lore a proper thing almost, where before its entries were far and few between, with short written lore for each character release, we were now getting huge entries and backstories for the characters. This as well as an entire lore character, the Observer, an ongoing process of expanding the game and its universe beyond what we see in the trials. This implementation years on from now is probably what's responsible for new expansions of the DBD universe, like Frank Stone, and even the sillier entries like Hooked on You, a time when the lore was finally given its time of day and given some core focus. Beyond the lore, and the thing people probably care about more, was the Rift, and the implementation of extra and seasonal progression, where you could earn charms, cosmetics, and more, with this update actually being the introduction of charms. 19 tomes on now, and they're still going, developing and getting better. This was a huge deal for the game, fulfilling moments or dips in content drops and expanding the lore greatly. Next up, we're approaching one of the game's most divisive moments. It was the 9th of February 2021 when patch 4.5.0 released, better known as the Movement and HUD update. This was a big deal for the game and a moment which completely changed it. It's a moment many will cite as the game's shift into feeling different and moving away from its roots. There was something very iconic about the old movement style, a certain aesthetic and fluidity to it that many even today seem to miss. This paired with the old HUD, which was also changed in this patch, together gave Dead by Daylight a certain feel, I think. One of the big reasons why I think this was disliked, aside it being a huge shift for the game visually, was because it was modernizing Dead by Daylight. It was changing how it looked and felt, even if the actual gameplay was mostly the same. It was a weird feeling of the game suddenly looking different. Upon release too, the animations definitely were not perfect and often looked fairly odd or clunky. The original HUD before its rework was also just an absolute mess that got memed on into oblivion. The main reason people disliked it though, I do think was because it was just a big visual change, which came perfectly in line with many of the map visual updates and stuff like that, but something like movement is down to player control, which is why I think it felt quite jarring. This shift in movement I think really did change the game a lot, and looking back, definitely for the better. Onto the 8th of September 2021. On this day, skill-based matchmaking, or SBMM, or MMR, was implemented into the game. This was a system to now place you into matches based on skill. In DBD, skill is measured by your escapes on the survivor side, and your total kills on the killer side. Seems to be the simple assumption for how it works. However well you do in the match will increase your MMR up to a cap. Depending on how high your MMR is, you'll be placed with others in your MMR or MMR range. This is a big shift from where before the game would place you into matches based on your rank. By rank I mean the old number system we had that was displayed over the player, the highest being Iridescent 1. However, these ranks were not always achieved by playing well necessarily, or even surviving in some cases. You could level up simply by playing a lot. This is how the old system worked. MMR isn't really that big a deal if you look at it closely, I think. It's actually not all too different from the original system, and is likely better overall. The main issue with MMR, I think, and the biggest way it changed Dead by Daylight, is by making it more competitive, whilst equally not being overly clear on how the system functions. MMR is still a huge debate in DBD, and probably forever will be. It's another one of those things people can't quite agree if it's good or bad. It's undeniably had a huge impact on the game though, and how it's perceived. It certainly also, I think, outlines the game as much more competitive, where before it would definitely seem more casual, based on its system. Either way, this is a key turning point for the game, and a moment that definitely changed it. We're zooming forward to the 19th of July 2022 and the release of patch 6.1.0. Patch 6.1.0 has got to be one of the most game-changing patches in Dead by Daylight history. For 6 years, Dead by Daylight's meta had realistically not changed all too much, debatably at all, at least significantly. This update made substantial strides to finally change that, nerfing key perks such as Dead Hard, Decisive Strike, and Hex Ruin, as well as many more, along with an overall change to over 40 different perks. We further got base kit borrowed time, an increase to killer action speeds and gen length, prestige reworks, BP reworks, and just so much basically. This was actually maybe the biggest update as a whole the game has ever seen. It was further the biggest meta shift we've ever had and might ever get. I say might ever get because it's sort of in question if it's ever going to happen again, and is still today pointed at as both a positive and a negative. It's understandable too because it changed that much, that it's not hard to have an opinion on it in relation to the game. It debatably led to bad things happening like the gen kick meta, yet it equally revived a bunch of terrible perks and made them viable. A much needed injection of life into the meta. Anyone you ask is going to have a different opinion on this patch, and whether it was a good one, a bad one, or a somewhere in between one. Regardless of what you think though, this was a moment that changed the game forever. Fast forward a few years onto a moment that I think changed Dead by Daylight, that might surprise you a bit. 7th of March 2023, the release of Tools of Torment with the killer, the Skull Merchant. How did Skull Merchant change the game forever? Well, I actually think she did quite a lot. First off, the key thing she did in my eyes was rally the community in a way we've never quite seen before. A character so controversial that to this day people still hate her after her many reworks. A character that made people quit the game, a character people DC upon loading up to face, and a whole lot more. I have a whole video really delving into Merchant that I'd recommend you check out, but to put it simply, people didn't like her and they still don't. To the extent of her getting multiple full reworks within a year, something that is completely unheard of. Not only this, but even reworks to elements like her Mori, due to community feedback. A character criticized like no other, even with broken states like Legion before, or more colourful divisive chapters like All Kill. Merchant as a character takes the cake in every way when it comes to the impact she had on the community. To further this, she is one of the most important moments I think, because she's responsible, at least I think so, for issues such as 3-genning getting as much attention as they have, with 3-genning now essentially patched out of the game with the new kick mechanics. A character responsible for the downfall of the first big meta post the 6.1.0 update. A character changed more in the span of a year than many have had in far longer. A controversial character who I believe was the catalyst for a lot of positive change. Bringing us up to close to the current day, the most recent game-changing thing I think came on the 23rd of April 2024. This was the game's shift to Unreal Engine 5. Whilst this is mentioned even in the patch notes to simply be the start of something, a basis for the future, it's still a huge positive. Much like the movement updates and the graphical Realm Beyond updates, it's almost a promise again for the years to come that the game will continue to improve and develop and update graphics. It was of course a bit of a controversial one though, with the update having quite a few bugs and issues that came along with it. It was a funny PTB, and even upon its live release, the game has had a lot of issues, which have been slowly ironed out. Looking at it wholly though, it's hard to deny that it's not going to be a huge thing for the game. We've already seen huge overhauls to the store and certain other menu elements. In the Dungeons and Dragons chapter, I do believe too that many of the new item systems that implement that the magical items and the in-game pop-ups are far more streamlined as a result of the new engine. Updating the engine means not only a committal to the future, but improvement and new possibilities as a whole, which I think we're already seeing the tip of, with that whole iceberg hopefully going a whole lot deeper. Alright, well, that's my 10 picks for moments that changed the game. What moment would you pick? Let me know down below. Thanks, and goodbye.